Okay, once again, thank you so much for giving this opportunity to me. So my subject this evening is brentuximab in Hodgkin lymphoma. That's the disclaimer. So a lot of antigens are expressed on the cancer cell. Some of them are specific to a cancer cell and not so expressed on a normal cell. And you can exploit that particular antigen to treat that disease with immunological drugs. Now, CD30 is one such antigen which is not too much expressed on T and the B lymphocytes, but highly expressed on Hodgkin cell. And that is the principle of using this drug in the treatment of Hodgkin lymphoma. Though it's not the subject for discussion today, but even in the non-Hodgkin lymphoma, anaplastic large cell lymphoma is CD30 expressing, whether it is systemic or whether it's cutaneous. There are some of the other T-cell lymphomas which also express CD30, and probably that will get discussed tomorrow, including in my talk on cutaneous lymphoma. To begin with, when antibody against CD3 were made and used, it was a disappointing story. It didn't work. But it's only the development of ADC, that is the antibody drug conjugate, that brentuximab vedotin became a very important breakthrough in the treatment of Hodgkin lymphoma and some other lymphomas. What exactly is a ADC? And this cartoon shows you that. What you see in the center is the monoclonal antibody. What you see as a rod-like structure is the linker. And what you see as the red ball is the chemical. You do not have indigenously made ADCs left and right because it has been a little difficult to synthesize or produce this molecule. You have so many monoclonal antibodies which are generic, but the pharma has struggled to make this molecule also because of its instability with temperature. Now, what exactly happens when you administer a ADC is that it goes and binds to a cell which shows that particular antigen, like in this situation, CD30. It enters the cell and then it releases that chemical, in this situation, the MMAE, because the linker is sort of destroyed. And then this chemical leads to the apoptosis of the cell. It can also leak out from this apoptotic cell and can damage other cells around, and which is a plus point because then you may get further control of the tumor. And the same thing is shown in the cartoon over here. On the left top, you have the brentuximab. You see how it is entering the cell, and then it is ultimately going and destroying the cell with the help of the chemical. Now, it is almost about 10 years ago that brentuximab was first approved in the relapse setting. Hodgkin lymphoma has a high cure rate. 80% of patients or 75% of the patients can be cured. Refractory patients and the relapse patients are small in number, but there hasn't been a very good treatment for them. The standard treatment was to use chemotherapy again as a bridge to autologous transplant if they are transplant fit. If they were not transplant fit, then these patients invariably relapsed. Even with the autologous transplant, the cure rate was just about 50%. For a long time, you did not have any kind of further progress in the treatment of Hodgkin lymphoma. Till about 10, 12 years ago, brentuximab got approval in US in 2011 and in Europe in 2012. So today we will discuss some of the current evidences for the efficacy of this drug, as well as what the controversies are, what the gaps are in the treatment of Hodgkin with brentuximab. So there is no doubt that from 2011 to 2023, there have been a lot of developments on this molecule which are helpful to the clinician. The indications have widened, And if you look at the approved indications, first of all, this drug has approved indications only in adults, though we are going to discuss the pediatric data, and pediatricians are using it off-label, but the approvals are all in adults. So if you take in the reverse order, at the bottom you have after failure of 2 lines of treatment or more lines of treatment using chemotherapy in patients who are not transplant fit. So we just mentioned that those patients who relapse and they're not transplant fit, the only thing you could do is chemotherapy, and chemotherapy, and the results were not good. So there was substantial number of those 20-25% of Hodgkin lymphoma who got their second line, who got their third line, but they would relapse, as you must have seen in your practice. You move up, then those patients who were transplant fit, they received chemotherapy as the bridge to the transplant. They got under autologous transplant. At the most, about 50% of those patients were through. So those 50% who failed became another approved indication for brentuximab. If you come little up, then there is a group of patients, as Prashant just talked about follicular lymphoma. There are bad risk follicular lymphoma. There are bad risk Hodgkin lymphoma who are more prone to relapse. This includes, we in one sentence, we always keep talking about relapse refractory, but refractory patients are bad patients. Relapse patients are not so bad. So those patients who are refractory to your first line of treatment, say ABVD, they are bad cases. Those who relapse very quickly after they've achieved a complete remission, they are also not so good. And those who have extra nodal disease are also not good cases. So these are 3 conditions where these are high-risk patients, and therefore this drug got approval as a post-autologous transplant maintenance for about a year, and is it given 3 weekly, so 16 doses. And then we come at the top, which is one of the latest indication, I would say. You had ABVD as the bread and butter for treating Hodgkin lymphoma. The Germans came out with more aggressive protocols and used BACOP and escalated BACOP. The world didn't take it. India has not taken it, and there's just a handful of patients who are treated with that kind of aggressive protocol. From the California, Stanford, you had Stanford protocol, which made radiotherapies an essential part of the treatment. So though the cure rates were equal to ABVD, but radiotherapy kept the clinicians away from the Stanford protocol. So in the bargain, 90 to 95% of the patients, just exclude Germany, and you will have all the patients being treated by ABVD. And that has gone on for about 4 decades or more. Could you little bit have improvement on that, either in the angle of efficacy or in the angle of toxicity? So those who have Hodgkin lymphoma will agree that Hodgkin lymphoma is a disease of young people. And if a young person, especially if you are a pediatrician, if a young person is cured of his cancer, then you're most concerned about the problems that you will face when he becomes another 20, 30, 40 years old. And that is an important problem, Hodgkin disease, where cardiac toxicity, other tissue toxicities, occurrence of second malignancy, etc., have been issues, because these people would live now for a long time, and they were not 70-year-old when the Hodgkin was diagnosed. So you want a drug which can probably reduce these complications. So this is sort of timeline of US FDA approval, which includes not only brentuximab, but also the checkpoint inhibitors. But the arrows today point out what have been the approval for brentuximab. The first arrow tells you about the previous slide, go in the reverse order, relapse refractory Hodgkin lymphoma, more than 2 lines post autologous transplant. And the second arrow tells you about brentuximab, relapse refractory Hodgkin lymphoma, post ASCT consolidation, because they were high risk, and we defined that high risk. And the last arrow tells you about the upfront approval of Hodgkin lymphoma, which is stage 3. Then there are indications for brentuximab which are not approved, but in clinical practice you use them. I always give an example of simple drug like metronidazole. It has no approval for amoebiasis, but you use it. So drugs are used outside. Rituximab is a classical example in hematology. If you look at approvals, there are so few, and you use in practice left and like water. So there are a number of conditions where you will love to use brentuximab, and they are put up over here. So you are using chemotherapy as a bridge to autologous in a refractory or a relapse setting. So can you use brentuximab over there? So a patient has received ABVD, he has not gone into remission, or he has relapsed. You're planning for a transplant, you will give some kind of ICE or some other protocol. Instead of that, can you use a brentuximab-based protocol? So that's the first one over here. This is a sort of offshoot of the study in which these drugs were used as the first line, but elderly group, patients above the age of 60. And the reason being that bleomycin has higher toxicity to the lungs in elderly people than in the younger people. And you would like probably to get rid of, when you come to those protocols, basically brentuximab replaces bleomycin. And then coming to the two pediatric conditions, and you will be pleasantly surprised that the pediatric Hodgkin lymphoma group is using brentuximab much before their approvals have come through, and the approvals is just a question of time. And these indications don't differ much from the, so there's nothing to discuss except the age. So you've got children, same indications which you use for adult can probably use for the pediatric patients. And I would say that is even more important because pediatric patient is going to live the longest. So you want the least of the toxicity of the standard drug combinations that you have. So to begin now in the order in which you put them, the Echelon study, which is the hottest subject because that's the latest approval for brentuximab 10 years ago in the US and so on. This study is well known to most of us because it is now not so new. So this talks about the first line treatment of Hodgkin lymphoma. All this talk is based on classical Hodgkin lymphoma because CD30 is not expressed on the non-classical Hodgkin lymphoma. So in Echelon study, the two arms were, as I mentioned, bleomycin being replaced by brentuximab. So you've got AAVD and you've got the standard ABVD. And you're looking at the modified PFS, which was higher in the AAVD than the ABVD. And that's what is shown at the bottom over here. The secondary endpoints also favored AAVD, and these benefits were sustained for a median follow-up almost 5 years. And at the center, you see the results at the end of 5 years. Not only that, recently in a press release, we now have data of 6 years of advantage of using versus ABVD. Because most of the Hodgkin lymphoma relapse in the first 5 years, and now that you have data of 5 to 6 years, you can say that probably a higher number of patients will be cured if you use brentuximab. Is there any downside of using brentuximab as the first line therapy? So there are some advantages, some disadvantages. This is a beautiful cartoon which talks about various kind of monoclonals and their toxicity profile. When you look at the brentuximab, the yellow speaks of drug used as monotherapy, and the red speaks of when the drug is used in combination. And when you look at rituximab, when it is used in combination, as Prashant said, you hardly ever use it single. And when you use it brentuximab, without discussing the toxicity, brentuximab is a safe drug. So that's one thing. What is clear about brentuximab is its peripheral neuropathy. And that is something you are always very conscious about right in the beginning in selecting the patient, where usually there is not much problem because again, they're young people. Diabetes is not a big problem. Diabetic neuropathy is not a big problem. So pre-existing peripheral neuropathy is not a big issue in this group of patients. But because it causes peripheral neuropathy and the peripheral neuropathy is dose-related and duration-related, you are almost always conscious about this fact. So these patients are very closely observed for development of symptoms, signs, doing their now conduction studies, decreasing the dose of brentuximab, increasing the interval of brentuximab, so on. So this kind of fine-tuning requires a little bit of careful follow-up of these patients. What is important is that although the AAVD arm had higher incidence of peripheral neuropathy than the ABVD arm, but at the end of 5 years, the percentage in both the groups dropped down to 19% and 9%, stating that peripheral neuropathy is reversible especially because you are conscious of this fact today, you take care of it, and also because large number of patients, when you say 67%, 43% may be alarming to you, but it was grade 1 and grade 2. And that is highly reversible, as you see quoted here. So it's not a huge issue in practice. You look for it, baseline, during follow-up. You can adjust the doses, you can reduce the doses. Dose of brentuximab is per kg, you can reduce the doses, and you can increase the intervals. The second was the higher incidence of febrile neutropenia in patients in the AAVD than in ABVD. And was this possible to handle? And the conclusion was that you need prophylactic GCSF. Prophylactic GCSF is not a huge issue in this part of the world because generics are available, so it's not discussed the way they discuss. But one thing is very clear, that prophylactic GCSF is mandatory when you're using a brentuximab-based treatment for Hodgkin lymphoma. The good part of it is the incidence of second primary malignancy and occurrence of pregnancy was not affected. Again, young people, so these two issues are extremely important. A pediatric Hodgkin lymphoma literature is full of all these things, and that is what was shown over here, that the number of patients of second primary malignancy were lower in the AAV, and the number of pregnancies were higher in the AAVD. There was a subgroup analysis for older patients where you are even more conscious about the bleomycin-induced lung toxicity, and it showed that people who are above the age of 60, once again, it has shown similar results and no extra toxicity. And 5-year follow-up once again showed that there is absolutely nothing to get scared of. And that is the pulmonary toxicity part of it. You have Hodgkin lymphoma patients who are higher risk, defined as disease or IPS 4 to 7. And these patients have lower 5-year failure-free survival because of their advanced disease. When you use AAVD in these patients and looked at the median follow-up at 3 years, once again, you're satisfied with the outcome. So patients with a high-risk Hodgkin lymphoma, again, should not deter you in using brentuximab-based protocol. So that was brentuximab with AVD. Has it been used in combination with other chemotherapies? So the answer is yes. So here you have got at least 2 protocols, etoposide, cyclophosphamide, doxorubicin, with either procarbazine, prednisolone, or if you don't want to use those drugs, dacarbazine and dexamethasone. And 3-year progression-free survival is to the tune of about 90%. And the toxicity profile, especially when you use dacarbazine and dexamethasone, was more favorable, and that is probably the combination to be used. BACOP as such, it's a discussion for them because we don't use BACOP in this country left and right. What about brentuximab monotherapy in unfit classical Hodgkin lymphoma? So it has been done in people who are aged, who are frail, or who got comorbidities. The drug was tolerable, but the results were not very exciting. So brentuximab monotherapy probably is not going to be the story of the day. You will have to use it in kind of combination, even in elderly, frail, and people with comorbidities. However, there is an important lesson to be learned, that there are people where you are very much concerned and where the families choose not to give any kind of chemotherapy, and you want to treat them with immunotherapy. Again, example being rituximab monotherapy being used in some patients where they don't want chemotherapy. And there are cases like this where the efficacy of the drug is important. This is one case where you see a huge mass on the right side of the mediastinum, CT scan of the same patient showing that kind of mass. And this is monotherapy with this drug, and you see what the the results. There may not be cures, but at this particular situation, you're not looking at cure, you're looking at responses without toxicity. But that's why you're avoiding combination with chemotherapy. Off and on, you'll end up with patients who have got liver problem with Hodgkin lymphoma. I don't know how to handle them because ABV is almost impossible to be administered properly in these patients because these drugs are all metabolized through liver. Monotherapy with brentuximab allows you to bring about a response which then can permit you to use even ABVD. And this is one particular patient like this where initially steroid was used, but the patient again had a problem with the liver, and then BV, and you look where you reached, and then you can use ABVD in the treatment of this patient. So this has been a tussle in the clinical practice when you've got bilirubin of 30 and you don't know what to do with this patient, and they often succumb because they've been able to do much. It is a place for this drug. Cardiac dysfunction affecting you to give anthracyclines in these patients. Here is a case where cardiac function improved after using this drug as a monotherapy. Difficult to explain, but maybe brentuximab was maybe the Hodgkin disease was the cause of cardiac dysfunction, and brentuximab improved it. And this is a publication which talks about the use of this compound in the first line in classical lymphoma, who are not suitable for chemotherapy because of either of these conditions, the BREVITY study. And this is a very, very nice recent article from the German group. He's going to be one of our speakers in Mumbai in the next coming meeting. He has spent almost 20 years researching Hodgkin lymphoma, and you should read this article about navigating increasingly individualized Hodgkin lymphoma. When a resident treats a disease, you do the protocol, but when the boss comes, he modifies it because each patient is different from the other patient. This article gives you those cases. Now, early Hodgkin lymphoma, the success rates are so huge that probably you don't look at any options. It's early favorable, early unfavorable. So there is data about brentuximab being used in this condition. The only problem probably with the early Hodgkin lymphoma is that this is combination treatment. You're using some amount of radiotherapy, 2,000 rats, 3,000 rats. You're using some amount of radiotherapy. Can you replace that radiotherapy was the question asked, and the answer appears yes. So if that's so, probably you can get rid of even this low dose of radiotherapy in early favorable as well as unfavorable patients. So those are a couple of slides showing you that the results are as good if you replace radiotherapy with brentuximab. I mentioned about pediatric indications and the people using it. So this is the data on the pediatric. There are published study of combining BV with chemotherapy under the age of 18, and the results have been quite okay. Here it is as a replacement of vincristine in particular protocols, and these are some more studies showing you again replacing one or the other compound. Here it is exactly what has been done with adults, and the results are to the tune of about 75 to 85%. That's the publication from Kelly, the champion of pediatric Hodgkin, brentuximab therapy in high-risk Hodgkin lymphoma in children. And those are the results. The upper curve is for the brentuximab based, and the blue is for all other protocols. This is event-free survival, and this talks about relapses. So it is better, plus it decreases the relapses. Now we come to where probably you and me are using it much more. The drug has not been officially available till yesterday. It will be officially available to you from this month or next month. That will help you as far as the cost is concerned, because at the moment, whatever our experience of brentuximab is by the drug which has been imported, it's available very, and everyone has used it, not only for Hodgkin, but also for the anaplastic large cell lymphoma and other T-cell lymphomas. So let's come to this where probably you will be using it much more common. Patients who relapse after an autologous transplant don't have many good. If they are very fit in past or probably even today, you subject them to allotransplant with all its morbidity and mortality. So this is the data which shows you. So you use various protocols, and there's nothing much to choose when you're planning a patient for transplant. And recent data has shown that brentuximab-based protocol, and one of the very popular protocol in the Western world, and whenever the finance permits in this country, is brentuximab with bendamustine, giving you probably the best of the results after the transplant. So as a bridge to the transplant, using brentuximab with a chemotherapy rather than just chemotherapy. Various kinds of drugs have been used. The last sentence also tells you that this can be done in the LO setting, which is, of course, a rare situation. So BV with chemotherapy, any kind of chemotherapy, whether ICE, DHAP, ESHAP, etc. But the one which I'm very familiar with, and probably many of you are familiar with, and the Western world is extremely familiar and have replaced all other combinations, is brentuximab with bendamustine. Little difficult protocol because you have to be conscious of occurrence of infections, etc. But it is all manageable, and this gives you the results as you see over here. So as a bridge to the transplant and as the relapse after ASCT are the two things we talked about. So brentuximab with immunotherapeutic agents is the latest story. This has been evaluated in the relapse setting. Both the drugs act by different mechanisms. So combination, totally chemo-free combination sort of is something very exciting. So it just once again talks about how BV works and how the checkpoint inhibitors work, etc. And these are early studies of phase 2 of combining BV with nivolumab. There's some study of triple therapy where you got 2 checkpoint inhibitors with BV. And there is not much data available of combining BV with Pembro, but this is once again a question of time. Case reports already exist. So all this data is now emerging, but early days. This is publication, brentuximab with nivolumab in relapse setting 3-year study. And that is an editorial on that combination. So we have seen brentuximab based upfront treatment, newly diagnosed, elderly, high risk, pediatric patient. Then we saw brentuximab as the third line after failure of autologous. Then we saw it as a bridge to the transplant, autologous. Now, what about brentuximab being given by choice as a consolidation therapy after the autologous? So we began our talk with that. 3 groups of patients who are at high risk of failure of autologous. So these are patients who are refractory to first line. These are patients who have relapsed within 1 year. These are patients who got extra nodal disease. So these patients by choice can be given brentuximab 1-year therapy, 16 doses after the AS. That's consolidation. And that's what is mentioned here, primary refractory relapse patient, extranodal disease, etc. And this has 30 months follow-up available with good success. And that is 5-year data and talked about that. Very well tolerated, good safety profile, and so on. So these are studies, now real-world data. So coming to the real-world data, several retrospective studies have been published also. And you got the Ethera trial over here, and almost everything, whether you talk about children, adolescents, adults, relapse patients as a bridge to autologous, etc., the safety and efficacy. And the data is, if you go into the depth of these articles, and there are a huge number of them, it's almost similar to what you've seen in the research trials. If you use brentuximab earlier as a first line or somewhere as a bridge to the transplant, can you use it after the patient relapses? So there is some amount of data, brentuximab being used in the as a re-challenge later on. And again, without going into too many details, it works. Like the rituximab, you can use repeatedly in various combinations. Re-challenge with brentuximab is possible and it works. So this is a tolerable, effective alternatives with all those references. So everything is rosy, or there are some unanswered questions? So there are unanswered questions, I would say galore. So despite the wealth of evidence, the brentuximab therapy for a classical Hodgkin lymphoma can be used upfront, can be more easily used as a bridge to transplant, can be used to consolidate the transplant, can be used left and right if the patient relapses after the transplant. It can be used monotherapy situation. It is commonly used in combination with various chemotherapy. and there is data for combining it with checkpoint inhibitors. The first biggest problem is that the data on BV with checkpoint inhibitor is early. So any use of this combination, whether upfront or whether as a bridge to transplant or afterwards, will be experimental. The advantage of BV with CPI versus BV with chemo or CPI with chemo, probably it will be many years before you can be very clear about it. And again, 1, 2, 3, what will be the cost analysis that has to be done to see, because these are all expensive molecules. The moment you come out of chemotherapy, these are all expensive molecules. So same thing over here, AAVD versus Nivo. So when you say that you like to use A in place of Bleo, why not checkpoint inhibitor? And same thing about first line, BV with CPI, we don't have enough data at the moment. And then about this whole business that you're doing a PET scan after 2 cycles of ABVD, and you are decreasing your treatment or increasing your treatment, you're dropping bleomycin, you're replacing with BI based on the PET, whether that kind of data will be elicited in AAVD. So we still have to wait for that kind of information. This is exactly what I just spoke to you about. Okay, so just I conclude my talk, and I hope I'm in time. So last 10 years of experience with BV after its approval has clearly demonstrated that after a long time, almost 30, 40 years of ABVD, you have a drug which can make an impact and replace ABVD. And brentuximab gives you confidence of using these molecules ADC in practice. Of course, you've had tuzumab, etc., also in your armamentarium. Many believe that this has become a standard of care. Recent long-term phase 3 data has the durability. I showed you 5 years data, published 6 years press release. The real-world data compares with the clinical research data, so that's a welcome news. And few questions, especially with the addition of checkpoint inhibitors now have come up, which maybe another couple of years and will research between the two, combination of the two, upfront, relapsed, etc., etc. Thank you so much.